does Nimisha want to intro it, as it was your topic?
Nimisha Patel, worked at EY for about 20 years. I'm actually come from a programming background myself. So that was when a world wasn't so, called agile, so we say, but we were agile because we used to do everything. We used to do the requirements. We used to do this and that, like everything end to end. So pretty much done that my whole life for 10 years of my career, and then moved across into program management, project management, done Prince 2, understood the waterfall ways of doing things for waiting for things to happen, and then moved into learning about Agile Scrum Master as a certification, and then started now implementing Agile. I'm actually a consultant, so I actually consult for digital transformations, mainly have been focusing on the finance space actually, and getting projects, budgets under control, because although teams have started to become agile, the finance processes itself haven't become so agile. And so what I'm looking for today is to have a discussion with you guys around how can we tie in finance processes to traditional spreadsheets, cost models, finance trackers, whatever you might call them, and how can they be adapted to the agile way of working? So putting in our work into ADO, understanding that, with value streams, etc., that's all great, but how do we get the actual nitty-gritty resource management, finance tracker, the forecasting, all of that aligned to the work?
Sounds interesting.
Yeah.
So it's something we wrestle with some of our customers with how does it work, and it requires a number of changes, but yeah, we can get into the detail of that. So I guess first questions then is how do you, I guess, what is the challenge that you're seeing? Is it that you're trying to attribute stuff to projects and programs? Is it that the sort of, the how you sort of calculate costs for various initiatives, or are you running things as BAU?
Yeah, so no, they're programs. So they're portfolios of products. So if I took an example of a client, portfolio of products, so lots of different products, but so many that you're going to have to split up a portfolio into chunks. So you've got work streams or portfolio products, however you want to say it. And then within there, you've got like 4 or 5 products which have their own, backlogs and work and things, and they're all independent of each other. There could be some dependencies, no doubt, but the key being that the portfolio itself at the top gets a budget, 100 million, whatever it might be, and that then has to be apportionized, for all the other products. Now, the way that obviously many companies are in transitions, no one is at that stage where they are, pulling down and drawing funds and things like that. So the clients that we're working with, they're actually, back in the day where they've got certain amount of money for each product, and then how is it that you manage that alongside the work?
Who wants to kick off?
I think Graham should be kicking off here, seeing as he's embroiled in a lot of this stuff.
Well, I had a question, but it's in a different tangent, so I don't want to derail, but I am quite happy to.
Derail as you like, man.
Right. So, because in your intro there, you said that you have been doing quite a bit of work to get budgets under control, and I thought that was quite an interesting use of language. And I wonder if that's something that you've seen as companies go through these types of transformations, where they are coming from a more controlled environment, both from a finance and a work perspective. Then they grant the autonomy over to the teams and say, "You're empowered. Go do your thing." Do the budgets spiral out of control as a result of that? I mean, and is it reining it back in to create control in the same way, or is it a new, different type of control that you think needs to evolve? Because of course we need governance, and we can't just let people spend what they want. But I guess, what does that shift look like for most enterprises to adopt that model?
I think that's a really good question. So I think what we're seeing on the ground actually is, as they are becoming agile for the first time in their life, putting sprints, this, that, and the other, recognizing their work, they can't burn as much money as they used to. So they've got teams established to start recognizing what is the work that we have to do, so that they can start, putting sprints together, et cetera, et cetera. But while they're doing that, they're actually spending money because they've got, bums on seats, haven't they, in essence? So what they're not realizing is they're not actually delivering value, continuously during, limbo period, shall we call it. And that is probably where the budget is spiraling.
Interesting.
I guess the easy answer to the question, or the simple answer to the question, is that projects and programs as vehicles of delivery don't exist anymore in the future. So therefore, you don't need to apportion budgets to them. The concept of short-lived vehicles of delivery is kind of a yesteryear concept, because the reality is when you build a system, are you never going to touch it again? No, you're not. You're going to keep touching it.
Yeah.
And especially with the fact that so many of the systems are now, especially with like SaaS products, you're going to regularly touch it. This is now BAU. So actually having a concept of a project and a program that never ends is kind of pointless, because why bother creating a business case for such a thing? Actually, now viewing that as BAU, and the reality is that most dev work is now starting to be viewed as BAU, and therefore it becomes a very different model. You're now bringing the work to a funded stream. So you're now funding a group of people, a delivery mechanism. So things like SAFE have trains and value streams, and the idea is that you fund a group of people. A group of people are capable of X, and therefore you have a look at what their throughput is, and then you understand that unit is capable of that throughput, and therefore we need to increase or reduce the size of that unit to be able to deal with the amount of work we've got. So the fact that you need to try and calculate what a project's capable of and justify a project no longer exists. What you do is you justify the segments of work that you pass to that group. So actually it's not what do we need to do and what's the start and end and what's all the work we need to do in front and calculate it. Actually, you don't do any of that. You go, this is our unit of throughput, and therefore each of the items that get pumped into that, you then work out whether they are useful relatively sort of compared to other items.
Yeah, I think this is a big issue for traditional firms that are fixed in a certain way of working, right? It's all about outputs as opposed to maybe outcomes, and a lot of the scope is defined up front and passed to the teams. It's that iron triangle of fixed time, fixed scope, fixed cost. But the challenge really is moving away into a new mindset, a new way of thinking, because I don't think we can do both. At the top level, if we're still thinking in that old school way of we're providing all the scope, these are the projects, and the teams are somewhat doing agile, but they're not really empowered because they're not actually defining the work, then we run into all these kind of problems with our budgeting. So it's much easier for a newer company to start operating like this, in this way, this lean budgeting thing that we're talking about, than it is for a traditional company. And it's a radical shift, and we need to get buy-in from the people at the top in order to be able to do it.
It's radical, but I think also it's the scariest bit is front-loaded as well, which in some ways is better, but also it makes it a lot scarier, right? Because we can show them all of the models and the things on the charts, but then, and it sounds great on paper, and then we say, so how we're going to work this out is by using data-driven to figure out the cost for the features and et cetera, and that's how we fund the value streams. We don't have any of that to start with. So the first, 6 months, realistically, till we get some reliable data, it is searching around in the dark, isn't it? And that's, you kind of have to let go and trust the process, or you try and keep some of the old rigid mechanisms on top as a bare minimum, it's like guardrails, but then you're probably elongating that 6 months out into maybe 9 or 12 months, because the process is not really, you just want a clean break, don't you?
There are ways of prototyping it that make it less scary, when you basically start viewing one vertical or one value stream, and you say, actually, we're just going to treat them as a department. And actually, we're now going to treat them as a department. So therefore, they are operating costs. We're still going to CapEx it, etc. But we're going to treat those as a department. So actually, we're just going to fund the people rather than try and calculate all the work that's given to them. And that becomes less scary, because the reality is large corporates, are they really going to, trust and just go with a new approach when it's a bit scary, especially sort of in finance space? people in the finance space don't do things based on trust or whims or belief. They do things on empirical evidence. So,
which is funny, isn't it? Because basically every company that you go to will have a company value that says we trust our people to get the job done.
We know that that's just a gimmick. So you're absolutely right. And that's how we're actually doing it. So that's how I've done it, which is to fund the people. So who are the people that you need to deliver this job, do you think? And let's get those people in there and let's understand how much they all cost, because then we can start understanding, okay, what's our run rate, I suppose, in a way. I mean, it's mashing old and new all together, it feels, right?
Mm-hmm.
The time sheeting becomes quite interesting. And then there are other concepts about, so how do we do that? If we're now attributing, so one of the things that projects we're doing and one of the challenges we run into is that there are different mechanisms for how you attribute cost with different individuals. So it could be that you have graduates and therefore you're getting some form of tax scheme from sort of local governments that allow you that if you use those individuals, actually it's cheaper. Or it could be that you have legacy bits of technology or brand new bits of technology, therefore certain bits are viewed as investment and certain bits are not. So all of a sudden the time sheeting pain doesn't go away, because you then need to still attribute actually where you're going to put those costs. And are there any, so the simple answer is, just fund it as a department, but actually it becomes more complex than that, because you still need to try and work out actually what do they touch, or you try and calculate it. But one of the things we've done is, you get into dangerous things like monetizing story points. Do you understand, I guess, what we're saying about monetizing story points?
No.
We've seen some organizations where they're trying to calculate timesheets and they're going, well, actually, instead of sort of timesheeting, what we'll just do is we'll calculate it from the work. And then they go, right, so a story point is worth how much? And you go, well, it's a relative concept and it could be different between teams. You go, okay, so how much is it? You go, well, you can't really do it like that. We want to put a figure on it. So they'll start calculating their story point as worth a day's worth of effort for an average developer. And then they'll try and go, right, so that many story points were spent on X. So therefore it's that. But the problem is it becomes very difficult to do that. And when you start monetizing story points, then it stops the team from being able to change them and defeats the whole purpose of what story points are. And it also means that you then start getting some nefarious practices where if you've got suppliers who are monetizing story points, you're saying, actually, we're going to pay you for 2,000 story points a month or something like that. It means one of the core concepts of Agile is, is minimizing the amount of work that you need to do to achieve the outcome. But when you monetize things like story points, actually, when people encounter work that doesn't need to be done and they're being paid on story points, then they still do the work. So there's that, it's quite a tricky subject to try and delve into as to how do we attribute cost. So actually what we try and do is simpler than that. And this is quite difficult for organizations to accept. Some have. So we work with some gaming organizations that are far braver with risks or making financial decisions. Yes. And they don't mind things that actually, how much did the whole unit cost us? What was the percentage work that we might want to attribute in a different way? And then we'll then say that percentage of that effort for that, for that group of people for that period of time, we then can then go is X. But some organizations want to try and manage it in a far more intricate, hours or days, and organizations that are still deeply into controlling the minutiae of the financial tracking, that becomes a lot more difficult for them to try and cater to.
I'm interested in how the organizations that you're working with are currently set up. So are they actually operating within real value streams, or is it still departmental cost center budgeting? So what exactly is happening with them?
So many of them are a mismatch of both of those all mashed together, really. So there's still the concepts of cost centers. There's still the concepts of trying to establish value streams for the work. And this is the complication, right? So from a finance perspective, like you mentioned, Simon, that finance are not going to really change for a long time. They're still going to get their reports the way they get them. They're still going to attribute them to cost centers, which then come into programs. So, and each program is still going to have a cost center. So that concept, I think, is still here for a little while. And it's about how do you manage to do that alongside the bit about the value streams and the work. I get that. And I get it. It's totally different. But the finance part just needs to be a bit more agile, I guess, in a way, isn't it?
What are there any, I guess, core challenges that you've seen that that seem insurmountable?
I think it's this, where they're trying to attribute the funding, which is not really funding. It's called budget, right? It's not called funding in true sense yet in organizations. It's not like I can draw this money down when, where companies are trying to still go agile in terms of getting their work in. They're not at that position where you can do drawdown. I know exactly what I'm going to do, and I'm going to need this. They're not at that position. So it is a budget, and it is this many people, and I need to manage it in a finance tracker because that's where I can manage resources. They're trying to manage that outside of a usual finance process to put that in an ADO. And I don't personally think that it works, but that's this conversation to see if you found a solution really for managing, resource to resource. So like you said, right, we fund the team. So, okay, so how much does this team cost? But where do you put that in ADO? Because in ADO, you just have the work, you have the epics, you have this. You don't do resource management as such in terms of hours and money, do you?
So is it that effectively you're trying to attribute the overall cost of a team for a period of time? Is it that you're trying to track it to an epic or a feature? Is it?
I think
it's a tooling challenge to me, right? Where do you actually what do you actually put that information? Because of course you can manage all of that with spreadsheets.
Yeah.
If you really want to, you can go super hard on Excel. But that sucks. Everybody hates doing that. So it's a tooling challenge of how do you reconcile that finance information that maybe you need, maybe you don't, depending on how you're configured, but still have the link to Azure DevOps and retain that agility, because there is no concept of money in those tools.
Yeah, it's that.
And I've seen a couple of plugins on the market that aim to do that, but they all aim to do it coming from the old world perspective of, well, what we want is to monetize story points and work out how much of each developer's hour time is worth, and the nasty stuff that we want to get away from. I don't think anybody's really cracked supporting that information flow, but with the aim of becoming more agile and creating more autonomy.
Yeah.
So is it that, because it sounds like you still have projects and programs in those organizations, and I guess that's the challenge, because those projects and programs are trying to track their own independent budgets rather than viewing it as a BAU budget, aren't they?
Yeah, and that's but then they've got CapEx and RevEx, right? So then their mentality probably isn't BAU yet. They don't see BAU until it goes into operational mode, really, do they? Traditional firms, let's be honest.
So you can still have sort of CapEx and OpEx, but you then attribute it to the types of work that are being done. So then you can effectively say that everything that's being done that's developing a system can then be capitalized. Anything that's up until that point, so any work that's up until that point can be viewed as operational expenses. And then you can say when it's gone into live, or any operating costs or bug fixing after that, you can then view as OpEx. So you can actually view the people involved, so the people involved in the development bit. So it actually becomes, arguably, you can say that the Scrum team, anyone involved in the Scrum team, can be then capitalized, with some exceptions. Things like the Scrum Master. A lot of organizations choose not to capitalize Scrum Master work because he or she is a facilitator. But so it then becomes about the role that someone's doing. rather than, so you can say actually those individuals are all of their work will be deemed as capitalizable work because that's the nature of the work that they're doing. Or you can say that actually, so 20% of their work is bug fixing. So you've had a look at the throughput and you can see that 20% of their work is bug fixing. So 80% of them is capitalizable. So you stop trying to calculate actually what are the boundaries of the work that they're doing that's a project, because it could be that certain, so we've had some organizations where the teams actually just get handed different project work, or it could be that the teams only report to a project and actually don't worry about that. Those people are permies within an organization. All of the work that they're doing is sort of capitalizable, so therefore that entire unit is capitalizable.
And I think in traditional sense, they're still programs, you know, where they've got the same development testing, those teams, and they're in multiple programs. So they're not working, the work is not really going to them yet. You know? So they're still in that transition mode, aren't they, most firms, where they're trying to create that.
That's what I'm referring to at the beginning, is that they're operating at a high level, they're not agile. So when we talk with our clients about, you know, transformation, you know, the focus is generally in the past has been on the practices that the teams are doing at the team level. And really what we need a system of support around the outside where we're all working in Agile to enable those teams on the ground to be adaptable and to do their job in the right way. Because at the moment, a lot of organizations are, like you're suggesting, struggling at that top level, and that's not supporting the teams to be adaptable. So I think the challenge is a mindset one, and shifting that at the highest level. Alongside the tooling, right?
It's ultimately because they still have the concept of projects and programs. That's the problem.
Yeah.
That's the problem, because actually you don't need them. You don't need them.
I think one of the ways we can get around this is, like Simon was suggesting, is we choose a small sliver of the organization, we set them up into a true value stream, and we start funding them in the right way, and we report on progress as we go through, and we start baselining some of those metrics, and as it becomes successful, then we slowly start rolling out across the rest of the organization. It's very difficult to do a big blanket change, and it rarely works that way, but there's opportunities, I'm sure.
100%. Yeah, no, definitely, I agree. They do, I've seen many firms, they do call the projects, I suppose, initiatives now, don't they? So they've rebranded them, and that's about it, really, but not in its true sense, in essence.
Yeah, project managers, you're now all called Scrum Masters.
Yeah,
go on exactly. A 2-day course and you're done. You're off to the races, and it's like,
and the PMO is called something else, Agile PMO.
Yeah.
At its heart, by abandoning the concepts of projects and programs, it seems scary, but the reality is projects and programs as delivery vehicles are bunched together groups of requirements. Some of those are worthy, some of those are not, and some of those, you know, that project and program is going to monopolize all the resources for the next year or two. So if you want anything done in your department, you need to squeeze it into that project or program. So they become sort of, you know, this wagon that you've got to get everything on. And there's quite a lot on there that isn't really truly justified. They've just been squeezed into that. So far better, actually, you've got your group of people who are your machine for delivery. And then you've got individual things that you then work out, you know, the relative justification for each of those things, and it can change. You know, it can change whenever it needs to. Something new comes in and you can slot it in, and then it just goes through the machine. So actually, rather than it be here's something we're doing, off it goes, and how do we change it? And it becomes very expensive to change it. Actually, you've just got the machine, it's funded, and then you just push stuff into it and stuff comes out. And it could be that you are doing something with an end. So therefore, you view that as sort of, you know, a short-lived thing that you fund. I'm going to fund that for 2 years, or maybe I'm going to fund that for a year, and then actually I don't have as much stuff to do anymore, so I'm now going to halve the size of that machine, and therefore I halve the funding of it, and clearly they'll get through a lot less work, but you know, that's only what we need. So it's kind of, at its heart, it works when you're no longer sort of viewing things as projects and programs.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly how life used to be back in the day, when I say back in the day, but, we were programming and I was working on desktop developments, we were creating application packages, but each package required work to be done, software to be developed around it, etc., etc. And it was, you were just funded as a member of that team. It wasn't like I worked on X project or X program and I only work on Microsoft apps, I worked on everything. And I think that's the mindset that's probably just missing, that concept of I'm just part of a team. I'm not actually part of X program anymore,
It it does lend itself to some other interesting stuff that's probably slightly off topic.
Yeah.
But it's probably slightly off topic because one of the, I used to be a program manager and a project manager, and I used to be a developer. And one of the things about the end of a project is the and therefore when you've got that sigh of relief and then the next thing kicks off and it's quiet and it starts getting busier and then it gets crazy, that's one thing that you have, that sort of, that you have periods of non-craziness. One of the challenges when you view everything as a perpetual machine is it now needs to be sustainable. You can't do things like having people work every weekend, because otherwise they're always working every weekend. So actually there's abandoning the concepts of projects and programs that leads to a lot of other things about how you treat your staff and how you create sustainable environments for that machine to keep working. It requires a lot of close attention. So it's not just a simple case of, we're just going to fund them in a different way. They now need to be viewed in a very different way and sort of empowered and treated in a way that's not going to damage their well-being.
Yeah, it doesn't burn them out. Yeah, in essence. Great topic to maybe talk about one day as well.
Yeah. So I mean, sort of Graham or Darren, are there any challenges that you've seen with in the sort of the various places you've been when organisations are moving to value stream funded?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is the stakeholders into that business, because you can get teams brought into the approach, you can get finance brought into the approach, and you can get maybe your C-suite brought into that approach, but then they have to go to an AGM or a shareholder meeting or something like that, and what the shareholders want is, right, here's what we're going to spend in the next year, and we're going to spend it on these areas, and we think that's going to produce XYZ results. That is how the shareholders think. And if you say to them, well, we're only going to look at the next 3 months, or it's 6 months worth of, they don't want that. They want to know, well, I'm making long-term investment choices, I need long-term financial information. So that, I think, is one of the hard bits, is how do you satisfy not just the people in the business, but all those that feed into it as well.
Darren?
And I haven't found an easy answer to that.
No.
It's a challenge. So I fairly recently came off of a large financial client, and they had a similar challenge, right? They were operating as a program which was funded outside. It wasn't really a value stream. They were just building they were actually migrating a legacy platform onto it and building a new version of it. And there was all sorts of problems with the senior stakeholders expecting certain things to be built. It had to be exactly the same as it was previously. So that's a challenging environment to operate in the way that we'd like to operate, because there's this feeling that it needs to, the old legacy system needs to be exactly the same as the new system, when in reality a lot of those features and pieces of functionality aren't necessarily always used. So there needs to be some sort of baseline around that at the beginning, making sure that we're really assessing what piece of functionality actually being used. So that there's lots of challenges in this regard, but there are ways around it. And I think it comes down again to the people at the top, wanting to change and being focused on the outcomes as opposed to the outputs necessarily, the individual pieces of work.
I guess it's when we saw the early agile implementations, they're all sort of driven by at the team level, and then sort of, you know, the team were doing their thing, and then all of a sudden there was the clash with the expectation from sort of the management layer. And we, you know, especially with, you know, what we were doing with Agilysys, we realized pretty soon that actually sort of, you know, telling upper management, don't worry your pretty little heads, it's something for the teams, was missing the point. It was actually, this needed to be brought in by senior management, because it was going to not just be team level things that needed to change. This was organizational change. This is why a lot of sort of, you know, especially the large sort of consulting firms are focusing on organizational agility, because actually for it to truly be beneficial, there needs to be practice and sort of methodology changes throughout the organization. It's not just sort of the IT team.
And it's not just the methodology as well. I mean, it's the mindset and the culture is the most important thing. And if you create that as a microcosm inside of one team or multiple teams or a value stream, whatever it is, they have to interact with the other business functions. You have to be interacting with finance and HR and legal. And if they're not on the same wavelength about how they think and do everything, you know, like incentives, how we incentivize people through bonus mechanisms and things like that is a classic example. If you don't change that as well, then people will be focused on their own behaviors.
It's
Yeah, and like that example I gave, I think they set up that program wrong in the first place, because they got all the people together that were just building that platform in the center, rather than thinking about the whole system and the value stream and where the value is coming from. So they had upstream dependencies, they had downstream dependencies, and interacting with those people that were working on the other systems was nigh on impossible. They were like big walls up. You had to throw things over the fence. You'd never get, you know, the things you needed. So I think it was set up in the wrong way at the very beginning. So yeah, it's got to be set up properly. We need to understand the value streams before we start doing this kind of stuff. Otherwise, we're just on a hiding to nothing. The teams are doing Scrum, but we're not actually agile.
I imagine some of the challenges that you're having, as you still have projects and programs that exist, they're trying to calculate actually sort of how long is it going to take us, and therefore if how long is it going to take us, who are we going to need, and if they're doing all of those things, then they go, actually, well, we probably still need to do some requirements, some sort of upfront requirements, and then we're doing upfront requirements, we'll need to do upfront design, and then and all of a sudden you're waterfall, you're not agile. So it's one of the core challenges with trying to retain the concept of projects and programs is that there will have to be an element of waterfall style behavior to manage that.
Yeah, so, I mean, the key is, yeah, like you just said, is business cases as well, isn't it? That's still, you know, many firms still have business cases as well. Okay, this is what we're going to deliver, and it's going to cost us X amount, you know. So that it's still attached a little bit, isn't it? Like still
business cases are fine, right? But the problem is when the business cases define exactly what needs to be built instead of focusing on the hypothesis that needs to be achieved, right? Yeah.
And the business cases are now attached to the individual things that you want to build. So not the entire project or program to try and justify that, because you know that's a funded unit. You're now a small thing that's going into that unit. So you're now calculating actually what's the effort that's required for just the smaller things. So the business cases are lighter weight, and they are against each of the components that are all the modules or what, you know, each of the units that are going into it. So it means there's a little bit more oversight rather than some giant nebulous sort of project or program that might have a load of hanger-on bits of sort of, you know, functionality. There's a lot more oversight, but the oversight is lighter. So it's sort of, you know, it's less, but on all the things going into the pipeline. So have we answered your question?
I think, well, in essence, you still have to carry on with finance processes, I think is my summary, right? I think finance processes itself is a separate beast, and you still have to manage, you know, you can't just worry about the work and not worry about the finances, in essence, you know. I mean, it goes hand in hand, as in, I mean, agile processes are one thing, using the tools, you know, managing the works, the epics, the features, blah, 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 and knowing that these are your team members to do that work is something. And then there's a separate part of it, which is just, okay, this is how much each of my people are going to cost. And I've got to forecast them for the year. Whether I use them for the year or whether I use them for 6 months, I'm not going to know that until my work has progressed, in essence, right?
I think that we should try to make our people as long-lived as possible, and not just for one particular project. We want to understand, what outcomes we want to achieve at each value stream, make sure we get the right people in, and then maybe they change over the course of a year or 2 years, but it's a long-lived thing that we want to be aiming for.
Are the people that are doing the work the same? Because most of the places, I mean, this won't be the case in all of them, but are they the same? Because a project might take these people, and then the project dissolves, and then they go join another project. But actually, those people are always still around.
Yeah, so not many firms have that, right? Because they're using contractors or they're using suppliers to come in and do their work. So many firms are not actually investing in their development team. So like I said, when I was a developer, we were the same for 10 years, and hence why we had all the knowledge that we'd built over those 10 years. Anybody threw anything at us, any one of us could do it, or we could talk to each other. We had established that concept. You don't see that in the world of work as much anymore, unless it's true software houses, but say if you're working in global clients, they don't have that concept, do they? Because they're hiring in services to do that work, and then losing that talent.
Depends on the strategic direction of the business. If I was the person owning one of these big firms, I would definitely look to be hiring in some permanent staff, and then topping that up with some contracted teams as and when we needed to achieve a certain outcome.
You have a look at the sort of the pipeline of the work that you're going to be doing, and the ups and the downs of the sort of demand on it, and then you make sure, I guess, your core is available. And if you're using contractors to then bulk that up, or sort of consultancy firms to sort of add in teams to deal with up and down, then at least at its heart you're dealing with it.
Yeah, 100%.
There becomes a slightly more of a challenge when you're using lots of different technical stacks. When you're using lots of different technical stacks, all of a sudden you need multiple machines that are able to deal with the throughput. So that starts becoming around how you sensibly architect your organization. But again, that's something for a different conversation. But
one other thing that's just crossed my mind is, are your clients doing annual budgeting, or are they? Yeah, see, I think that's another challenge.
That's another problem.
We don't know
firms, right?
Yeah, we don't know what we're going to be doing for next week sometimes. So that needs to be happening a little bit more regularly. I think there needs to be syncs on, so we can adjust and flex as needed, right?
Yeah, and I think that's it, right? So I think many firms don't do that. So, for example, I'm not saying on a weekly basis, but maybe on a monthly or a quarterly basis, what they need to just keep on reviewing. Okay, this is how much money we've got in the pot. This is how much we've spent. Okay, this is how much we've got for the next pot, for X amount of time. And instead of going to a year, because a year is impossible, and then you make drastic amendments according to whatever's left in the pot, per se, isn't it, really?
Yeah, I think quarterly is a good starting point. If we can move to quarterly budgeting, then that's a good thing.
Yeah. So thank you. I think it was really good. I think we need to still figure out a tool. So I guess we'll magically think of a tool where you could actually move away from fantastic spreadsheets with lots and lots of macros inside it, just to manage finances. Even to manage it on a quarterly basis, you still need a tool, right? And at the moment, as it stands, a spreadsheet is the most robust, with lots of nice Power BIs, no doubt, as dashboards around it.
So it'd be actually interesting to maybe get you into a bit of a brainstorming session, because we've got a software platform that, it basically visualizes the work that's being done across a program or multiple programs, portfolios, etc., and how we can perhaps, at some point in the future, incorporate some of these financial aspects into that. I think that could be quite useful.
I mean, because it's a valid, I guess, challenge as to, the concept's all well and good, but then how do you attribute the costs or calculate them afterwards, reconcile who did what? And like you say, it hasn't gone away. You still need to do it, even if you're viewing these as different concepts. But then how do you do your time sheeting? How do you attribute the work? If you've got some special sort of calculations, and some organizations are doing plugins into Jira, and to be honest, or into ADO, and to be honest, most of them aren't very good. And it's because it's a fledgling world where the software industries are scrabbling to try and provide offerings that are actually robust enough for finance processes.
I mean, I'm a programmer for years, and I'm also in depth with finances and in depth with creating cost models myself. And I personally have not found a way that work and money, in terms of, day-to-day money, I'm not talking about the budget and the fund and all, I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about the day-to-day financial processes. I can't see how they can match together. I just can't find myself a tool yet, unless I develop one.
We did some interesting stuff at one of our gaming customers, and it was around, but they were far more pragmatic around how we were attributing costs, and it was based on levels of work, and here are the things that came into the pipeline. So therefore they were making decisions on, well, that one was clearly capitalizable, so anyone that touched that, so we could get that from our time sheet. So it started becoming it, but it wasn't granular where the dev did, I did an hour on that, and then I touched that for an hour, and they were just, so they became a lot more, they stood back and took sort of generalizations rather than trying to meticulously calculate each and every hour. I guess it's down to each of the firm's financial practices and their risk appetites and how they view things as to how, and each firm has a different appetite. And when they want to do things meticulously, all of a sudden, I'm not sure there's a lot of tooling that's going to support that at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a few ideas, I suppose, that they could move towards, but that would involve a lot of trust, like you say, not to go into the detail then. And bring it up.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely possible with a value stream approach. Yeah. But the hard part would be keeping people in the areas that they need to be. And you'd almost have to have a walled garden between the system that you're using for work and the system that you're using for finance, but still have a tight integration. Because otherwise, the development people will probably start looking at the finance thing, and some manager will go, oh, I can work out how much a story point is worth. And likewise, I think the finance people will want to do the same thing, because it's one of those things that sounds like it will be useful, and unless you know all of the broader context, you can't foresee how destructive it would be. And so that, I think that's the hard part, is making it clear. Just don't look over there. Don't just look at the spreadsheets or these dashboards. And don't look at that.
And most portfolio teams are not really not finance, but you don't have either or, right? So an agile team, PMO, for example, those traditional names, those teams are not in the detail, either in finance or in the development team itself. So equating money, just to story points might just not work. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Most of them see it because they see a number and they go, oh, you've got a number there. Oh, if you've got a number and you're using it to calculate how much work, how much effort work is, then we can just put a financial figure against that number. Bingo. Now it's easy. And actually, that's bad and evil.
Yeah. So, it just creates too much admin work as well. That's not necessary. It's just not necessary to create more work. You've just talked about well-being. It's not part of the, you're meant to keep life easy.
I mean, our cop-out is we tend to do things differently depending on different customers' risk appetites. So how we try and attribute the cost, we try and do sort of different, and usually they've got very different tooling. So we then have to help them with their, with whatever tooling or timesheet mechanisms they're using to achieve the goals that they need.
Yeah.
So, So Darren's comment earlier about let's have a side chat, and maybe we can build this into a tool that we have. Yeah, that sounds good. Then we can go to customers. Actually, it's funny you ask that.
I think most of them have this problem already, and they're probably, they're all trying to crack their brains and they're all trying to make it all match. And I'm like, I don't think the spreadsheet's ever going to work in your agile tool. Unfortunately, it doesn't work in attributing works and epics and features. You're going too deep. You probably don't even need to go there. So
it was lovely to meet you, Nimisha, and if you've got any follow-up points that we might want to consider, then yeah, we'd love to hear them.
Okay, great. No, thank you. It's very good.
All right.
Cheers.
Great chatting with you.
Nice chatting with you as well. Bye.
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 Bye.